Hello, I'm Joshua, and I'm an INTP, and first and foremost, I would like to say thank you for viewing this video and subsequently visiting my channel. The topic of this video is going to be on myths about creativity, and what I mean by on myths about creativity is that there have been several studies done in psychological research and cognitive science and neuroscience that pertains to the phenomenon of creativity. And there are many tests or batteries out there to assess one's creative ability. And so these batteries and this research has led to several modes of explanation for the differences in creative output amongst people. And so within these hypotheses of why creativity differs from person to person or from group to group, there is the prevailing hypothesis that because children show high levels of divergent thinking ability, and children also tend to rate themselves as creative more frequently than adults, or at least individuals from the ages of 4 to about 12 rate themselves as more creative than individuals from 12 to 17, and they rate themselves as more creative than individuals from 17 to about 18. And so these are longitudinal creativity studies, and they're looking at why might there be a difference in individuals. And one of the prevailing hypotheses, because creativity, the likelihood for somebody to identify themselves as creative and divergent thinking ability goes down with age, is that schools are what is driving out creativity in individuals. And the first thing I would like to say about this hypothesis is that I think it's flawed. And why I think it's flawed has something to do with the research and how the concept of creativity was even examined in the studies. So creativity, when people say that it's schools that drill out creativity in people, and they're citing this because of a single batteries that test for certain creative functioning individuals, what they're assuming is that creativity is a single dimension. It's a trait that's a single dimension, like IQ. And I would agree that you can use various cognitive performance batteries to assess one's levels of creativity, but I would not agree. But I would say that you can only test certain aspects that would tell you that someone is more likely to be creative than another individual, but that these batteries do not test for creativity directly, and test for creativity far more indirectly than, say, maybe how an IQ test tests indirectly for, let's just say, general intelligence. That's what IQ measures. And the reason I make this argument is because when you look at IQ and its correlation to general intelligence, it's about 0.67. But then when you look at creativity as a construct, there is no agreed upon definition for what constitutes creativity. And creativity can be looked at in terms of, from the standpoint of the personality dimension, openness to experience, from the standpoint of its cognitive functioning aspects, such as remote association capacity, I should say cognitive functioning abilities, such as remote association capacities and divergent thinking capacities in an individual. And creativity also can be analyzed from the perspective of achievement. And to me, well, creativity because it's like this, has to be a multifarious phenomenon. And just in my own research, I guess, just yeah, in my own research, I wouldn't. When I say research, I should say investigations, but it's just theoretical research. I haven't actually done any studies or anything. I've just read. I mostly what I present in these videos are my take on meta-analyses that I do. I've read a lot of literature on creativity in psychology, neuroscience, and cognitive science, and I've read people's psychology books on creativity, and have watched as many lectures as I can find on YouTube about the science of creativity, and have read various books on, biographies specifically on eminent individuals, and I've watched a lot of documentaries on eminent individuals. I have to say that I've read probably 30 biographies. I don't know how many papers, watched 17 documentaries, and I've watched probably over 20 some odd lectures, and I've probably read at least 32 papers. And so I'm just saying from that perspective that it doesn't seem to me that creativity is a you can think of it like as a single dimension like IQ. And that's why you can find various cognitive batteries that attest to measure the same thing, but then have discrepancies amongst themselves. And where you see this most evident is that you can test individuals for creative achievement, and you can test individuals for creative ability per se. And you will see that there's a correlation between the highest creative achievers and those with the highest creative ability per se, in terms of divergent thinking and remote association abilities. However, that is not true always, in the sense that the individuals that score highly on divergent thinking do not always score high in creative achievement. And individuals who score high on remote association do not always score high in creative achievement. In fact, creative achievement is a much more harsher, or I should say scrutinizing battery, in the sense that creative achievement only considers individuals creative when they have some sort of creative production. To me, just, I guess one can say, my bias is just that that's a better indicator of who is creative and who's not creative, because it's not the case that, well, it is the case that those who can generate novel and useful ideas can generate more ideas than the average person. But it's not the case that just because anybody can generate different ideas than the average person, or more than the average person, that they generate better or greater ideas amongst creative individuals themselves. So, not to be too picky, so I should be, because I'm talking scientific matters. I'll say this: so creative individuals are going to be different than the general population, but creativity, as it's appraised from a societal standpoint and an individual standpoint, is always going to be appraised from the standpoint of the background of reference of creative individuals. So, creativity probably can't be measured like IQ, because you can just, that shouldn't be the only kind of way it's measured. So you could make a curve distribution for creative abilities, and plot people in terms of how they stand out across the population sample, but you would only be, I suppose people could make the same argument for IQ. It's not the fact that everybody with an IQ over 160 happens to be a genius, but I tend to say that that's because to be a genius, you have to also be highly creative, and there has to be the right environment and various factors like that. Genius is more rare than high IQ, exceedingly more rare than high IQ. But it's, to me, if you don't consider a genius someone with an IQ over 140, that is. But to me, the same argument can't really be made for creativity in this way, that when you look at who's creative, or you would ask out of a population who is the most creative person in that given population, it's always going to be with respects to the other creative individuals in that population. So a person doesn't need to be able to just generate novel ideas or more ideas or differing ideas than, your general population, but from whatever creative population that they're a part of. So all most people will probably consider most musicians creative and most painters creative. But in terms of the selection process that goes on in the music industry, or whenever music teachers are listening to various kids play and do improvisation and things like that, amongst musicians, those who can really evaluate creative musical output, they do not consider all equal in terms of their creative ability. Similarly with artists, so a lot of people go to art schools, but it's not the case that every person who goes to an art school or every person who learns to paint, the artists themselves would consider every single one of them creative, because creativity is more than a skill, and it's more than pure ability. And so, in that way, it's the case that creativity isn't something that can really be evaluated in the standard way that you would do a single dimension like height or IQ. Doesn't seem to work like that, because there are multiple factors that are a part of creativity, where IQ is a single factor. But so as this pertains to people's assumptions that schools drum out creativity from kids, I would just say that first, the citing of the fact that people's levels of divergent thinking go down as they age, I wouldn't say that necessarily shows that schools are responsible for getting rid of creativity. It's partly due to the fact that children, divergent thinking ability in and of itself is not a good predictor for creative achievement, and two, that when children are of a certain age, they don't actually have a prefrontal cortex. Their prefrontal cortex wired fully, I should say, or myelinated completely. And so the parts of the brain that are involved in creative output are the default mode network, and you have to quiet a certain part of your prefrontal cortex, the part of your prefrontal cortex that is critical to information and ideas. And that's the way that at least it's speculated that's how not speculated but hypothesized. I mean, it seems consistent with respects to experiments done with jazz artists and hip hop artists who were freestyling and doing improvisation. Improvisation in and of itself is not completely the expression of creativity, but it's closer to the real deal. So this is part of, it's closer to the real deal than, say, performing a already standardized piece. So the reason anyways, so, yeah, so there's an issue or concern that just popped up in my brain for me. So part of stop. I'm going to try to stay on track. So the issue that that to me typifies is that people's creative abilities are going to diverge whenever they age, because their prefrontal cortex is becoming more myelinated over time. You can't really blame that on schools necessarily. Now, it's true that people succumb to peer pressure and various things like that, or they are instructed by the environment in such a way that they lose that unique spark. Well, part of that's due to the fact that most people are fairly agreeable and conscientious, or more agreeable and conscientious in their personality, and so even if they do have the capacity to have loose associations, which is basically what divergent thinking tasks measure, they're not going to want to insist on developing those abilities, because if it's not shown by the environment to be useful, then agreeable and conscientious people tend to ignore it, and they don't tend to foster whatever kinds of abilities or things or thinking that do not jive with the rest of society and their cultural structures. And I wouldn't blame that on school. I would say that that's a factor of personality, and so it's a factor of personality, and it's a factor of the fact that the prefrontal cortex isn't fully developed, because kids from the ages of 2 to 4 are still learning to listen to the world itself. Kids are pretty self-centered, even from the ages of 2 to 12, and it's not that they become less self-centered when they're 12. Well, yeah, you could say they become less self-centered, and they start orchestrating their opinions on those of their peer groups and things like that. But that's because human beings are social creatures, and I don't think you can pin that on schools. But I'm not saying schools are the best in their current construction to foster and facilitate creative output. I just don't think that you can weigh the blame on schools. I think that you're looking at human nature and personality fundamentally, and it's the case that divergent thinking ability is going to go down in most people's most people's lifetime, for a number of reasons that has nothing to do with school or academia or instruction or anything like that. Next, I would say this, so one, creativity is not a single dimension. Two, you can't blame schools for a lack of divergent thinking amongst students, and three, I would say this. So back to the school thing and the divergent thinking, or kids' tendency to rate themselves as creative, to say, yes, I'm a creative person. So this goes back to what I was saying about creativity is only really can be evaluated by people who are in creative fields. I'm not saying that people can't generally recognize when somebody's more creative than the average person, but whether or not you're going to be recognized as creative has more to do with if you're more creative than everybody else in your field. It's not really, whether or not you're more creative than the average person, because, a homeless person to a certain extent is more creative than the average person, but most people don't consider homeless people exceptionally creative. Or in the sense that homeless people have a greater capacity for divergent thinking and a loose association, or they can. Not every homeless person is a schizophrenic or something like that, but, let's just say people with mood disorders and things like that have a greater capacity for those various thinking tasks, but that we tend to use to measure creativity. But you wouldn't necessarily say that those individuals are more creative than the average person, or are more creative than or that they're the most creative musician, or that they're the most creative physicist, or they're the most creative writer, or somebody like that. There's a reason why there's been at least billions of musicians and not very many musical geniuses, and billions of writers and not many seminal writers, and many mathematicians and physicists, but not many eminent ones. And I would say that I would say sticking to that narrative, you know, even with the eminent individuals and the creative geniuses over time, the reason why we recognize them as creative geniuses is because they are more creative than their peers. I mean, that's obvious, but the point I'm trying to make, I suppose, with this is that as kids are going through school, they're comparing themselves to one another. I suppose is what I should say. So it's not like most kids are going to keep up their creative activities because, creativity is involves skill. That's one thing, and two, even when students are of the same kind of skill level, roughly, I mean, like, they're whatever. You're not gonna whatever when you can find two people that have the same kind of skill or training or exposure to some task, you will find that the person who is higher in trait openness and divergent thinking and remote association is going to produce something that falls more along the lines of something someone would consider creative. And there's a reason for that, because they're coming from an intuitive standpoint where most people are not. When you're using your subconscious and various whenever you're opening your conscious mind up to the thoughts and associations of your subconscious, those things are going to diverge from the normative procedural memory and various kinds of memory you use to appraise other aspects of the world. So your I guess the best way to put it is just that intuitive people, whenever they tend to do things, they tend to diverge in terms of their relevance to whatever a person is familiar with. And what I mean by that is this. So when you ask kids to sit down and give you a picture of a house, not all the kids' houses look the same. And some kids are going to draw houses that they've seen before. Some kids are going to draw the house that they live in. Or some kids are going to draw some kind of mock sketch of a house that's more like a hieroglyph or something like that. It's like kids are going to differ in terms of what they put on the page, and it has nothing to do with especially if they're all using finger paint or whatever. It has nothing to do with the fact that one person has more training or skill than the other person. However, there are some kids that when they decide they're going to paint their house, they're going to paint Howl's Moving Castle or something like that. Even though that's not necessarily completely original, the interesting thing is that it's going to diverge from everyone else, because even if all the kids have seen that movie in that classroom, not all of them are going to be interested in that idea necessarily. And this has to do with trait openness. So people tend to notice open kids over other kids because open kids are eccentric. They're just weird. And they're not eccentric or weird because, they're eccentric or they're weird because they're not locally referential. And they tend to be just that. I mean, like eccentric in the sense that they don't dress like other kids. They tend to have their own little way of coming up with expressions. They tend to have their own ideas when they're coming up with art or whenever they're doing something. They tend to be more opinionated and emotionally sensitive than other kids, and they tend to be more prone to daydreaming and liking to play or enjoy their imagination. And that's just not all kids. And you'll find that those people consistently are the people that are at the top of creative achievement. I mean, you also need a relatively high IQ to have a high level of creative achievement, surprisingly. So nobody would. I wouldn't have guessed that. I mean, I suppose I would, because it goes from domain to domain, and I mean, IQ is relative to domain, with respects to domain. So the IQ of a eminent physicist, and when I say eminent, I mean has won a Nobel Prize, is usually roughly 154.6. And so obviously they have a higher IQ than most people. Um, Nobel laureates and chemists, I think, have 145.8 or something like that on average. So obviously they're more intelligent than most people, like obviously. But at the same time, I mean, you don't need an IQ of 200 or or yeah, I mean, like the physicists get close to 160. But anyways, the point I'm trying to make is that it differs from field, and for writers, I think it's like 125 or 130 or something like that. I mean, obviously somebody who has an IQ of like 125 or 130 is smarter than the average person, but I mean, it's not as high as 140, which is the, I guess, Stanford Binet definition of a genius. Those people are not technically geniuses in those ways, but you know, economists and neuroscientists and physicists and those people are those kinds of geniuses, but they're simultaneously highly open people. Like they're very open, and they usually have differentiating experience in comparison to their peers. I mean, whatever. So I guess like whatever. The point I'm trying to make, at least what I should get back to, is the fact that kids are comparing themselves to one another, and whenever you're watching your other peers in the classroom, who's more creative than the other kids. And it's not like kids, whenever they notice that they're not winning the creativity game, that they want to keep playing. I mean, for the most part, we're social animals, and so if we're playing a game, we tend to not want to play games that we can't win. And it's the case that certain factors like early exposure and things like that help in a student's overall ability to express their creative output per se. But I mean, the open kids kick every kid's ass when it comes to creativity. I mean, they really do. Partly because openness to experience has a relatively high association with creative output. I mean, it has the only correlation with creative output next to the aspect of industriousness and conscientiousness. In terms of personality, creative people come in a lot of different packages, but about the only thing that they seem to have in common is high openness and moderate to relatively high levels of trait industriousness. So, and high IQ, but that's about it. Like everything else differs for whatever reason. um, uh, you know, and so I suppose I want to say most precisely that you can't blame schools for not instilling creativity in kids, and I don't think you can teach people to be creative individuals. I think you can teach people to be more prone to things like divergent thinking or loose association or anything like that. I guess we're going to try to do social eugenics in the sense that we're trying to select for more creative people. And I suppose over the course of time, people will become more open than not. There are a lot of social incentives for people to become more open than they have been in the past. Creativity is valuable from an economic standpoint. That's why the hell everybody cares about it. But it's definitely not the case that, at least right now, well, it's definitely not the case that school systems are why most people aren't creative. Like, most people aren't creative because they're not creative. I mean, creativity is an amalgam of things. I mean, or at least I'll run through the list. So, you need to have personality factors that contribute to creative achievement. If you're looking at creativity from the standpoint of creative achievement, you need to be fairly highly open, and you need to be smarter than the average bear. I'll be frank. Partly why you need to be smarter than the average bear is because you have to consume more ideas than most people, and if you're not relatively adept at picking up ideas or skills and things like that, it's relatively hard. It's relatively hard to be creative or to play at the creativity game. Let's see. So yeah, you also need to be industrious. I mean, because if you're going to be creative, it's about working and doing things. So creativity is a process, in like many other, I guess, creativity is a process. I mean, that's all I'll say it is. It's just a process. Because there is a creative cycle or creative phases. There's phases to creative output. And so it's a case that you have to be industrious because your ability to consume ideas and your ability to learn skills also is predicated on your ability to actually get to work and do something. Um, then most creative people have high levels of expertise in more than one field or domain. So most people who are eminently creative were exceptional at several things. I mean, there's too many examples for me to try to give. To be honest, and it's the case that even with Nobel laureates in physics, you tend to find that somebody who has a Nobel prize in physics is also an exceptional violin player, or as a really good short writes poetry, or has published a novel, or something like that. It's kind of strange. And part of the reason why that is because even in physics or even in mathematics, not everybody's highly creative, and the highly creative physicists and the highly creative mathematicians are the open ones. But most physicists and mathematicians aren't very open. Most university professors or most scientists are not very open at all. They're actually most of them are highly conscientious. That's why there's not many. That's why there's not many of them, because most institutions, what they do is they flatten open individuals and prevent them from getting to the top because they have so many damn hoops to jump through and things like that to get to some place where you can be eminently creative and things like that. Einstein didn't have the greatest time in school, and there's a reason. There's a reason for that, because if you're open, you're not exactly dutiful and all other sorts of things that's required to be a good student, per se. And there's no guarantee that you're going to be an agreeable person either. So, yeah. Anyways, so you usually need a certain level of expertise, and usually more than one thing. Usually more than one thing. I'm not saying this is a guarantee, but that's at least what has been shown in studies and research and things. I'd say too, you need the opportunity. So part of the reason why most people aren't creative is because to be creative is kind of expensive, in the sense that, well, to live in the West, I mean, there's a reason why creative people come from wealthy families, because if you don't have to worry about your survival and things like that, or I mean, in the sense like this. So part of the reason why creativity and personality disorders have a correlation is because you're usually not creative unless you have a problem to solve, and you're usually not going to be able to solve various high intellectual problems unless you have time to muse about them and tackle them and things like that. And so if you can't find it the case that you have a timeshare in Vienna or something that you just retreat to and write, or you're going to be poor. Henry David Thoreau was relatively poor because he decided not to work and just stay in a cabin at Walden Pond. I mean, hell, Virginia Woolf killed herself. And why I mention that is because, whenever, for whatever reason, you're positive people, happy people are not creative people. They're not. Most creative people are not happy. They're something. They're depressed. They're irritated. They're irritable. They may be enthusiastic, and they may like positive emotion and things like that, but creative people usually aren't emotionally regular people. That's just not something that's a part of the profile of creative people. And that has its consequences, but I guess ultimately I suppose what I'm trying to say is that, if you're going to be somebody who has a mental disorder, then it helps to have money. I mean, it really does, because, well, And even if you don't have a mental disorder, it's just the case that, say for example, so I should probably pick a concrete example to bring my point home. So say for example, you decide you want to like try to solve the Goldbach conjecture or something like in mathematics. I mean, like no, so most people don't know in mathematics. Like, I mean, I don't know. Like, yeah, let's just pick. Okay, so let's see. I gotta pick something. Say you want to be a creative musician, right? And you want to be, what kind of musician do you want to be? Let's say you want to be a really good guitarist, because that's generic, so people are going to understand that. Okay, let's say you want to be a really good guitarist. One, you have to learn how to play the guitar, so that's a relatively difficult thing. Two, you have to kind of master the landscape. So in this sense or this vein, creativity doesn't spring out of the void. So you're probably going to have to play and practice many different songs in order to get a tolerable and technically precise sound in the first place. And your ability to play the great guitar solos of classics is going to be indicator of your ability to generate your own original things. And I mean, that's the case like more times than not, which is surprising. A lot of times people think that creativity is just something that springs out of the void, but creativity has a high correlation with expertise. I mean, the better you are at doing something, generally the more likely that you can be creative. But, you know, there's a reason why creativity has a correlation with openness and not just pure expertise. But yeah, you need to have a relatively high expertise at the guitar, and in order for you to get that expertise, I mean, there's factors like IQ and opportunity basically that come into it. I mean, if you don't have much to do with yourself and you can just kind of lounge around and play the guitar and not have to work or something like that for whatever reasons because your parents are rich or something like that, and you also are relatively intelligent, which it tends to be the case with people who are of upper middle class socioeconomic backgrounds. You know, it's partly why the upper middle class and the aristocratic class of America produces most of the high performers in the world. You know, it's very rare to find somebody who's high performing at any particular domain and they're poor. That's actually like a very difficult thing to find. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. It's just not as likely. And, well, there's reasons for that. Because to become exceptional at something and to develop a high level of expertise means a developmental process to a certain extent. And if you're going to carry that developmental process out, I mean, there's got to be things that are sustaining the environment such that you can do that. So, you know, and IQ helps, you know, because you do have to learn everything else that everybody else has to learn, and there's like learning is painful for somebody with a high IQ just as much as it is for another person because you don't always understand everything, and you know teachers aren't always the best explanatories of certain things, and some writers just absolutely suck. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why it might take some time for you to learn something, but maybe you don't spend as much time learning it as other people and you see patterns in things relatively quickly. But it's the case that there's a learning curve for every person. I mean, it doesn't matter, you know, what their IQ is. Everybody has to learn things. And so what I'm trying to say with that is even though, you know, IQ can shorten the developmental process, it doesn't actually shorten the overall, well, it does shorten the developmental process, but it doesn't actually reduce the overall amount of labor you would have to do to learn X, Y, Z skill. I mean, it's all equivalent. It's just that it happens faster for somebody with a high IQ. You know, that's all. But, I mean, in the sense that IQ is like power. It's not that it's the force you can generate within a certain amount of time. It's not the overall amount of force it takes to lift something. It's just the amount of force you can generate in a short amount of time. That's why people, whenever you, or at least like the type of IQ, when we think about IQ and fluid intelligence, it has a high correlation with speed or time-based things. But given, you know, no time constraints, it's definitely the case that, well, there's a reason why, people without high IQs can be high achievers because after a certain point in time, it just comes down to really studying something and disciplining yourself and working on something, and that's why it takes a little industriousness to be creative. But ultimately, you don't honestly have the opportunity to do many things like that if you don't have the environment that if you don't live in an environment that's conducive to allowing you to do that for whatever reason. And so it's definitely the case that there are a lot of factors that go into, why somebody is highly creative and why another person is not highly creative. Some of it has to do with personality, some of it has to do with cognitive ability, some of it has to do with cognitive ability that's not IQ, some of it has to do with their familial environment and their socioeconomic background. I mean, there's 1,001 bloody freaking things. And I'm sure you can put some of the blame on school, but what people tend to blame schools for is not really, what schools might be guilty of in terms of stultifying people's creative outputs. I mean, even if schools did try to be environments that facilitated more creativity, you're not going to have it that everybody is creative as everyone, the next person. You're going to have differences still then, and when you have those differences in kids still then, you're going to find kids that are going to say, you know what, trying to be creative is just not for me, or I'm not a creative person. They're just not going to identify themselves as a creative person. I mean, hell, you can do it with YouTube. I'm not even going to cite myself, but you can look at different people's content, and you can see that some people have a lot of ideas, some people don't. And, it's just a case, or I shouldn't even say a lot of ideas. Some people have a lot of ideas, but they're not very good ones. Or some people have a lot of ideas, and they don't diverge very far from, the mean sample of ideas that tend to revolve around that topic. Even if you want to reference like MBTIers, I'd say Michael Pierce and Talking with Famous People are more creative than your other people. I mean, I've never watched C.S. Joseph, so I really can't comment on what he has to say or anything like that. But some people stick to a script, some people don't, and I don't even mean like a script in the sense that they're actually reading from something. Some people generate content. Some people actually generate new ideas and have new perspectives on things, and some people just rehash things or put different names on things, but they're not really doing or coming up with anything new per se. So yeah, I mean, and it's going to be like that for everything, maybe over time we'll select for people to be more creative because, it's economically useful to have creative people in your society. Who would have known? I mean, you could have guessed it, but, people are starting to catch on for the most part. I mean, like, Jesus Christ, how many businesses just want people to be creative so that they can sell more things is, astronomical. Blame Steve Jobs and Apple, basically. Or Einstein. I mean, like, even you take the theory of relativity, for example, and you can realize that because of the theory of relativity, we have computers in our cars. It's like we wouldn't have things like that if it weren't for the theory of relativity, or all the physics, the quantum revolution that happened from the 20s to the 60s. Most modern technology is a result of a very small time frame of physics. I mean, and everything we're doing right now, and all the innovations we're coming up with right now. I mean, all of it comes down to ideas per se. And so when people are deciding, I guess, what traits are more valuable now, it's not, creativity matters in the world because it leads to economic productivity. So yeah, that's my video. Thank you for watching.